When the guns finally fell silent over the ruins of Stalingrad, the snow did not hide the horror, it preserved it. Out of the 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered to the Red Army in February 1943, only about 6,000 ever returned home. The rest simply vanished, consumed by the endless white of the Russian winter and the brutal machinery of Soviet vengeance. They were not prisoners. They were ghosts. Men who had once stormed across Europe in iron columns now trudged barefoot through frozen mud, their uniforms torn, their faces hollowed by hunger and disbelief. They had seen death in battle, but nothing prepared them for what came after surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. But for these men, the war was just beginning. One fought not with bullets, but with starvation, disease, and despair. They were forced to march hundreds of miles to Soviet camps. Many fell where they stood, their bodies left unburied, frozen in grotesque poses of exhaustion. Those who survived the march found something worse. Work camps deep in Siberia, where temperatures dropped below 30 degrees, and food was little more than a bowl of thin soup. And the cruelest part. For months, Berlin broadcast messages promising their safe return, while Stalin's prisons quietly erased them from existence. What truly happened to the German soldiers after Stalingrad? The answer is one of the most haunting buried truths of World War II. The winter of 1943 was unlike any other. Stalingrad, once a proud industrial city, was now a graveyard of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The once mighty German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had been encircled, starved, and crushed by relentless Soviet counterattacks. By the time Paulus surrendered, his army was barely an army at all, just skeletal men clutching rusted rifles, their strength drained by hunger and frostbite. Many hadn't eaten in days, some boiled leather belts for food. Others lay in ruined basements whispering prayers that no one answered. The Soviets, having lost more than 1 million of their own in the brutal defense, were in no mood for mercy. The surrender at Stalingrad wasn't just a victory, it was revenge. And for Stalin, it was personal. The Germans had burned Soviet villages, executed civilians, and starved entire regions. Now Soviet soldiers marched their captives eastward, into the very lands they had once tried to conquer. The journey began with the death marches. Tens of thousands of POWs were forced to walk for weeks across the frozen steppe with almost no food or shelter. Guards shot anyone who stumbled or fell behind. Survivors recalled how the snow was dotted with frozen corpses every few meters, a road paved in death. When the prisoners reached the makeshift transit camps, the suffering continued. Lice, dysentery, and frostbite spread like wildfire. Men died in their sleep, too weak to stand when morning came. Those who endured were packed into trains and sent deeper east, to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Urals. Their destination, Gulag labor camps. Here, their identities were erased. Soldiers became prisoner number 48, or laborer 1032. Their mission, rebuild what they had destroyed, Soviet factories, railways, and cities. Food was scarce, conditions unspeakable. Rations were based on productivity, work less, eat less. And if you stopped working altogether, you starved. The cold didn't just kill the body, it broke the mind. The men stopped talking about home. They stopped dreaming about rescue. They became machines of survival, existing only for another day of breath in the frost. It was a slow death. And the Soviet Union made sure the world would never know the full truth. Every morning began the same. A shrill whistle in the dark, the creak of frost-hardened boots, and the endless line of prisoners trudging toward the labor sites. In camps like Beketovka, Tambov, and Vorkuta, the prisoners lived under unimaginable conditions. Wooden barracks with gaps wide enough for snow to drift in, lice-infested blankets, and a diet that barely kept them alive. Guards barked orders in Russian, though most Germans didn't understand a word. A single misstep, a glance mistaken for defiance, could mean a rifle butt to the skull, or worse, a bullet in the snow. At first they told themselves they would be exchanged, that the Geneva Convention protected them, that Berlin would negotiate. But as months passed, hope began to rot. The Red Army viewed the Stalingrad prisoners as monsters, the invaders who had reduced cities to ash. To them, these weren't soldiers. They were retribution made flesh. Rumors spread through the camps. Some said those who volunteered for special labor would get better food. Many accepted, only to be sent to mines so deep and deadly that no one returned. Others spoke of camps in the Arctic Circle, where the sun never rose, and the frost froze tears before they could fall. The survivors formed brotherhoods of misery. They shared bread crusts, whispered stories of home, and buried their comrades in the frozen ground when the guards weren't watching. Yet not all guards were cruel. Some, themselves broken by war, looked away when a prisoner collapsed. Some secretly left scraps of bread near the barracks door. But mercy was rare and dangerous. By 1944, of the 91,000 taken prisoner, fewer than 20,000 were still alive. And then came the disease. Typhus. Dysentery, tuberculosis, each wave killed hundreds. The Soviets did not separate the sick. The corpses were carried out at dawn and burned, their ashes mixed with snow. The winter of 1944-45 was the cruelest. News reached them that Germany was collapsing, that their homeland was being bombed into ruins. Some cheered, believing it might mean liberation. Others wept silently, realizing they had been forgotten by both sides. A handful of prisoners clung to survival through sheer will. They carved makeshift calendars into the walls, counting days, months, years. Some wrote their names on scraps of cloth, hoping someone someday would remember. But the world had already moved on. When the war ended in 1945, few even knew these men were still alive. The Soviet Union denied the existence of many camps. Families in Germany received official letters saying their loved ones were missing in action. For most, that was the end of their story. But for the survivors, the true nightmare was far from over. By 1946, the death toll among Stalingrad prisoners exceeded 80,000. The few survivors, little more than skin and bone, were transported again, deeper into the Soviet interior. They worked rebuilding bridges, factories, and railroads destroyed by the war. The irony was haunting. The same men who had reduced Stalingrad to rubble were now forced to rebuild it brick by brick. Their days blurred together, dawn to dusk, labor, nights of coughing and silence. Some couldn't bear it any longer. Suicide became the final act of control in a life stripped of humanity. Those who endured learned to kill emotion. To survive, they became empty. And yet, even in this darkness, flickers of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared what little they had: an extra spoon of soup, a rag for a wound, a quiet prayer before sleep. Some found strength in faith, others in hatred, vowing that if they lived, they would never forget. Then, in 1949, word came that a repatriation program was being planned. Most didn't believe it. They'd heard promises before, but this time trains really did arrive. Columns of broken men were loaded aboard and sent west. When they finally reached Germany, reporters were stunned. These were not soldiers, they were ghosts in tattered Soviet uniforms, eyes hollow, bodies twisted by frostbite and hunger. Out of 91,000 men captured, only 6,000 survived to tell their story. The rest were buried in unmarked graves scattered across Russia, their names lost to history. The world celebrated the end of the war. But for these men, the war had never ended. It had only changed its face. Those who returned to Germany were not welcomed as heroes. Many were met with suspicion. Some accused them of collaboration or propaganda lies. Others were simply forgotten, their suffering inconvenient for a nation trying to rebuild. But in their silence lay the weight of history. These men had seen the worst of both sides, the brutality of Nazi command and the vengeance of the Soviet machine. They had lived through the collapse of humanity itself, where mercy meant death and memory meant pain. Some tried to rebuild their lives. They married, worked in factories, raised children, but the camps never left them. They carried invisible scars, the sound of frozen boots crunching in snow, the smell of unwashed bodies in overcrowded barracks, the faces of friends who died in their arms. It wasn't until decades later, in the 1980s and 1990s, that historians uncovered Soviet records confirming the fate of the Stalingrad prisoners. The truth was worse than anyone had imagined. They had been used as labor to rebuild the Soviet Union, then discarded once their strength was gone. Even their graves were erased when construction expanded. For Russia, it was a story of revenge. For Germany, a story of shame. For the rest of the world, it was a reminder that war spares no one, not even the defeated. In every photograph of a Soviet work camp, you can see them, thin silhouettes fading into the snow, Each face tells the same story, a man who entered Stalingrad as a conqueror and left as a shadow. And yet, in that shadow lies the deepest truth of war. Victory is never clean. It demands blood from both sides. It devours the innocent and the guilty alike. And the silence that followed Stalingrad, the silence of 85,000 vanished souls, is perhaps the loudest echo of World War II, because in the end, it wasn't the bullets that destroyed them, it was the cold, the hunger, and the simple fact that once they surrendered, they ceased to exist. But perhaps the deadliest weapon of all was the silence of those who never returned.